Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Welcome to your Thursday edition of Let's Talk Tropics. A very, very busy day yesterday as Hurricane Milton made landfall on the southwest Florida coast right around Siesta Key about 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 our time last night as a Category 3 hurricane. Fortunately, it did weaken somewhat from that Category 5 status that we were seeing a couple of days earlier, but we are still getting more of the reports of the damage and the flooding and the storm surge and a lot of the fatalities coming from those tornadoes that developed along the east coast of the Florida Peninsula. So we'll get into all that, and we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the records, at least some of the records that we've got so far, because I think as we go through time, there's going to be a number of records that are going to be broken by Hurricane Milton as we go through the next several days. But I've got a few of those, kind of the highlights of what was going on with Hurricane Milton over the last several days. So currently here in Lafayette, we have another beautiful day, 83 degrees, and the dew point is 60, so it's very comfortable out there with a nice breeze out of the northeast. And of course, the skies are crystal clear here in Acadiana with mostly sunny skies just about everywhere you go. Really, really pretty day on tap for us here at home. And as Hurricane Milton starts to exit its way off toward the east, big ridge of high pressure is coming in. So with a cold front kind of following in behind Milton, fortunately for all those folks that don't have power over parts of Florida, are at least getting to experience some cooler and some drier air, which might help them be a little bit more comfortable while the power is restored, which is going to take a number of days, of course. And our next cold front is actually there off to the northwest, coming onto the Pacific coast, and that's going to come and visit us sometime early next week. But getting back to Hurricane Milton, it is still a hurricane, and the coordinates are there on the left-hand side of your screen. Eventually, this is going to be classified as a non-tropical low-pressure area as it's kind of running along with that front. So what's going to happen is it's going to lose its tropical characteristics and become more of what we call a cold core system. So it's not going to be creating its own energy. It'll be creating its energy based on the things that are around it. But that low is going to continue to move away and head out into the ocean, and eventually will get kind of washed out over the next couple of days. So we will be saying goodbye to Milton, but I have to say, with some of the forecast models that we had during the week, they did very well, and I believe the National Hurricane Center did a really good job as far as getting the word out when it comes to much of central and southern Florida being ready for this particular hurricane. And to tell you the truth, a week ago today, a lot of the models were just kind of pinpointing as at a weak trough of low pressure over the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, kind of meandering around. So by the time we got into Saturday, we just went from 0 to 60 and nothing flat. And we'll go over a little bit about that with some of the records too. But as you can see, there's still some showers that are grazing the east coast of Florida, kind of shoving their way southward. Unfortunately, those are the areas that really got hit with the severe weather with the tornadoes yesterday. But the eye of the hurricane is now moving well out to sea. It's a little hard to see, but it's right about in here, right off the east coast, and will continue to push away. So things are going to be improving over much of the Sunshine State. Winds are still holding at 80 miles per hour. It's screaming along out of the east-northeast at about 20 miles per hour. So again, it will be a cold core non-tropical system here probably by the time we get the next advisory a little later this afternoon. And it's still pretty breezy on the east coast. Port Canaveral is one of those areas near NASA where we had a little bit more of a higher storm surge once the hurricane moved offshore early this morning. And in Daytona Beach, you can see things are still very, very rough out there this afternoon. And even into St. Augustine, which is pushing a little bit farther up the coast, they still have some big rough waves there and probably some higher than normal tides to go along with it. And finally, we go up to Jacksonville, Florida, and you can see how rough the seas are there. Even with the hurricane making an exit, they're kind of getting that onshore flow on the backside of Hurricane Milton. So we still have some rough conditions going along there along the northern coast of the Atlantic there, stretching up from about Cape Canaveral, then all the way up into Georgia and portions of South Carolina, also experiencing some rough seas and some higher than normal tides, and a little bit of storm surge kind of to go with it too. And Florida. I will say that the power outages, it's affecting 3.5 million people, and there's about just under 12 million, what it says on this graphic, that are tracked. So it looks like about a third of Florida is without power. But I don't know if you've been watching some of the video that's been coming out of Florida. Some of these it's amazing where you see like a crane that's hit a building, but yet the building still has electricity. And there's a lot of other areas that seem like they have fared well when it comes to power. I know there's a lot of folks that are without power there, but when you think of a Category 3 hurricane moving across the peninsula like that, I would expect almost 100% power outages for the entire path of that storm. So I don't know what Florida's doing with their infrastructure to manage somewhere under 75%. 75% maximum in some cases where we're talking about power outages. So there are a lot of folks that did manage to keep power across much of central Florida. So that might be something to look out for other states that are here along the Gulf Coast, because when I'm starting to see roofs blown off and flooded parking garages and things like that, but yet the electricity barely even flickers, they're doing something right over there when it comes to the power. So I know there's a lot of folks that are going to be suffering without power, but just from other hurricanes and living here in Louisiana and seeing what's happened in other states when it comes to electricity, I'm just really kind of amazed with how well they have done when it comes to power. Also yesterday, I think one of the things that sometimes does get overlooked when it comes to hurricanes, and there are so many different elements that come along with hurricanes. Of course, we focus on the wind and we focus on the storm surge and we focus on the tremendous amounts of rain. But there's also that component of severe weather. And what ended up happening yesterday is you had those outer bands that were kind of sliding there northward from about Miami going up the east coast of Florida. Well, at the same time, you had that wind shear that cut off all the moisture on the bottom of the hurricane. Everybody kind of made that note that this was another one of these lopsided hurricanes where more of the precipitation was on the north and west, but it was encountering that wind shear that was really tearing apart the bottom part of the hurricane. Well, that shear kind of overtook the eye and continued to push eastward well in advance of the eye, and those outer bands that were kind of moving northward along the Florida coast started to rotate because the storms were moving north, but the wind shear was coming in from the west. So what ended up happening is these small storms started to rotate, and we had 45 tornado reports there over the Sunshine State this time around. So on top of the wind reports, and what's going to be really interesting is determining whether or not these were actual tornadoes, especially the ones that were not on video, because after that you had so much hurricane wind come through as well. So it's going to be kind of hard to do the damage surveys to see exactly how strong some of these tornadoes are. But I will say on radar yesterday, some of the tornadic signatures that were there, they were just so obvious on there. And here in South Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast and much of Florida, you don't really get those tornadic signatures on radar that are so well defined like you do when you see some tornadoes in maybe Texas or Oklahoma. So it was really almost the perfect setup for that severe weather. And unfortunately, I know we've had some loss of life there over the east coast of Florida, and that was all due to the tornadoes. And I don't think folks may have been as much prepared for as many tornadoes because you're still thinking about storm surge and gusty winds and flooding rains. But that is one of the elements of a hurricane that sometimes is overlooked. But let's go over some of the records. And again, these are just some of the highlights of the record. So we all know that it dropped in pressure down to 897 millibars. There are not a lot of hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin that drop below 900 millibars. So this is the fifth lowest on record with 897 millibars on that pressure. And it was the sixth fastest wind speed of any hurricane. And look, it's a tie. So 180 is a tie, I believe, with three other hurricanes, and then there's a few of them that are 185, and then Hurricane Allen in 1980 is 190. So hurricanes in the Atlantic getting into this 180 to 190 range are really starting to push the envelope. Now, the fastest in a hurricane in the Pacific is 215 miles per hour. So you're talking about what is the upper end of the scale that's actually possible for some of these hurricanes. But 180 is definitely at the top of the scale. It's the fastest hurricane going, or system rather, going from a tropical depression to a Category 5 hurricane, and it did it in just about 48 hours. So that is what we call explosive intensification, not just rapid intensification. And it's the third fastest hurricane to go from Category 1 to Category 5. And even though this isn't a record yet, it is the fifth hurricane to strike the Gulf Coast this year, and that happened in 2020, and I want to say 2005. I can't remember the other year. Maybe it was 2017. But it's only happened 2 other times, and there's only been one time where we've had 6 hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast, and that was back in the 1880s. So again, you might start to question those numbers a little bit because that's 140 years ago. But 5 hurricanes have made landfall on the Gulf Coast this year, and hurricane season isn't over yet. So looking at the Gulf of Mexico, isn't it nice to look at clear skies pretty much all across the Gulf? It is hurricane free. It really is a pretty day, although the winds are still pretty brisk out there and the seas are going to be a little bit rough. Now, the Caribbean also has some moisture that's starting to build. Remember weeks ago we talked about the Central American Gyre, and the Central American Gyre probably had something to do with the development with Hurricane Milton, as well as what was left over of a tropical depression that was actually on the Pacific side over here that kind of meandered its way into the Bay of Campeche. So the combination of those two, and then there was a tropical wave kind of coming in from the east. But that Central American Gyre, and I've got the description of that below here on this video, so if you want to go back and read about it a little bit later on to kind of get yourself a little more familiar, it's really just a big, broad area of low pressure that is right over Central America, and it's usually pretty solid there in June, and then starts to weaken in July and August. So that's why we get a lot of development in this particular area during the early part of the hurricane season. Well, then it starts to come back again during the month of October and November, which is also a reason why we get a lot more development out here in the western part of the Caribbean, even down here in the Bay of Campeche during the months of October. So that's basically where Hurricane Milton formed, and there's a possibility we could have some additional development. Some of the models are indicating other stuff, and I know we're just getting done with Milton, but in this particular segment, or what Let's Talk Tropics is we're always trying to look at the forecast too to see if there's anything else coming in. And I know everybody's kind of storm wary along the Gulf Coast as it is, but hurricane season isn't over yet. And the more you know and the more you understand how all these patterns work, the better you can kind of figure out what the forecast is going to be as well, or even try to make your own forecast. But the more advanced notice that you know that there's something out there, the better prepared you're going to be. But out in the tropical Atlantic, believe it or not, Leslie is still hanging out there. It kind of dropped off for a tropical storm, if you didn't know, as we were focusing mostly on Milton. But it regained strength to a hurricane once again, packing winds now at 90 miles per hour. We do think this is going to go ahead and finally curve back out to sea, and it should weaken over the weekend. So nobody's really worried about Leslie out there in the middle part of the Atlantic. So the only thing that we're really looking at, let's go back to the satellite here real quick. The only thing that we're really looking at, or at least the National Hurricane Center is looking at, is this area here that's just now coming off the African coast. There's a possibility we could see some development there. It's a low-end chance right now because it's still over land, but as it moves over the Cape Verde Islands, it kind of works its way off toward the west. Depending on what the atmospheric conditions are, it might have a chance to become a tropical system. But most tropical systems this late in the hurricane season that would develop that far out in the Atlantic likely will not be coming toward the Caribbean, the Gulf, or the East Coast of the United States. Not saying that it couldn't happen, but the majority of systems do kind of turn northward and turn away. But that's just for the next 7 days. There's this other product here that's the Global Tropics Hazard Outlook, and it looks at week 2 and week 3. So this actually came down yesterday, or the day before yesterday, on Tuesday is when this is released. And it is still indicating the possibility of some activity still maybe in the hot zone here over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. And we're going to talk about some of the models and show you that there are some indications that maybe something could go on there. And then going in the following week, the last week of October is also pinpointing that area. Not super high on the chances, 20% or less, but that again is looking out week 2 and week 3. So really anything that's that far out wouldn't as far as forecasting, there's really no guarantee because we know that those forecasts are going to change. But it also kind of pulls into some climatology there. As you can see that a lot of tropical storms and hurricanes do tend to pass through the western part of the Caribbean, or form or pass, either way, the parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And then a lot of times, just like what we saw with Milton, they do tend to steer their way back off toward the northeast into the Atlantic, because you start to get these cold fronts that start to come across North America. But a lot of times you get some development down here in these particular areas, but they usually do turn away. But it is kind of unusual, like what Milton was, to have something develop out this far west and then make its way a little bit farther toward the east. Again, it's one of those things that doesn't happen often. It's not that it's never happened, it just doesn't happen very often. So we did see some unusual things, but things that certainly are not impossible. So let's just go ahead and get into the models. And again, now that Milton's going away, we can kind of just peer into the crystal ball and look out 10 days. And there have been some things shared on social media over the last couple of days. Got a few messages on Facebook as well. And what you're going to be seeing here as we go into Sunday, this is Monday, this is Tuesday of next week, Wednesday of next week, Thursday, Friday. So you're going out a week from today and then going into the following weekend, next weekend. You can see there's a bit of a low pressure area trying to develop over the western part of the Gulf or the Caribbean Sea. And at least on this model run of the GFS, it's kind of pushing its way off toward the west-northwest, possibly into the Bay of Campeche. So this model has been indicating some development over the western part of the Caribbean, but I've been seeing some solutions. Most of them seem to want to kind of drift this off toward the west, toward the Yucatan. I have seen a couple of them that go up toward Louisiana. Most of them are kind of shifting their way off toward the northeast. A couple of them even going toward Florida. And again, this has kind of been showing development over the western part of the Caribbean, but then the final solution of where it might go has been kind of all over the place. But when you start to get model run after model run after model run that's indicating something developing in that area, you do start to watch it a little bit more. But the next thing you're going to do is you're going to compare it with some of the other models. So we'll move on with the Euro. So even though the GFS has had several runs in a row that's indicating something developing in the Western Caribbean, as we compare it to the Euro model, all I can really see is an increase of moisture in the western part of the Caribbean going out into next Thursday or Friday. There's really no definitive low pressure area, maybe a broad area of low pressure trying to develop here over the Yucatan, but that also might be part of that whole Central American gyre that's out there. So when you get that Central American gyre, you sometimes get some development in this particular part of the world. So it is something we'll watch, but the Euro model is kind of inconclusive on anything developing. So so it's different than what we're seeing with the GFS. The Canadian model is also showing maybe a little ripple of energy going out into not this coming weekend, but the following weekend. But there's also a really big ridge of high pressure that's going to be diving southward across the central U.S. And to tell you the truth, that front might bring some significantly cooler temperatures as we get into the mid and latter part of next week. You think this fall weather is nice? Well, some of the stuff that I've seen on some of the models is going to show you, wow, it can really feel like fall, perhaps going into next week. The icon doesn't go out quite as far as the other three models. It goes out 7 days, but there is a bit of a moisture gathering there across the western part of the Caribbean once again, and maybe a little bit of a low pressure starting to develop there by about day 7. But again, that's a little more inconclusive for the forecast farther out, because this only goes out 7 days, not 10 or more like the other models do. So GFS is indicating something, and I'll say the icon is kind of indicating something, but the Euro and the Canadian still out to lunch right now. So even though we've got some consistency from model run to model run on the GFS, I haven't seen a whole lot of consistency on the icon, and then the Euro and the Canadian model just are kind of out of agreement with the other two. So really, we're just in the early stages of kind of watching this area. Doesn't say that we're going to see something, and it doesn't say that we're not going to see something. But it is an area that we should pretty much monitor for the next week or two. And for the very reasons is this is where a lot of tropical systems tend to develop during the month of October. Now, the water temperatures there are plenty warm. The Gulf of Mexico is starting to cool down, but remember, it's got to be over 26.5 degrees Celsius. That's the 80-degree threshold there for Fahrenheit. And on this map, anything that's yellow or brighter, so yellow going to red and pink, is over 80-degree water. So pretty much all of the Gulf of Mexico is still primed to be able to form or at least sustain hurricane or tropical systems, except for right along the immediate coast. We're starting to get those temperatures to drop down just a little bit there. So that might have been part of the indication too, one of the other factors of why Hurricane Milton weakened a little bit, not just with the shear and that cold front coming in, but there were some colder waters right off the coast. And we talked about that a little bit in Let's Talk Tropics earlier this week before that landfall. Wind shear right now is a little on the strong side there over the Western Caribbean and of course right here along the Gulf Coast. And then going into next week, you can see the wind shear does kind of drop off a bit, at least according to the GFS here. There's a large area of very low wind shear, but there's also a pretty good trough that's going to be digging here across the middle part of the country. That's that cold front that I was telling you about going into next week. We could see that. So there's going to be a lot more wind shear over the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, which hopefully would keep anything away from Louisiana. I was talking earlier to my wife saying, wouldn't it be weird to see a cold front come in and drop our temperatures in the 40s and then a few days later have a hurricane or a tropical storm come by? Because you're so used to having hurricanes happen during the middle of the summertime when it's really nasty outside. But I did want to, before we let you go, want to kind of show you where we are when it comes to the progress of a hurricane season. So a normal hurricane season has 14 named storms, and Milton was number 13. So we're ahead of schedule on the named storms. And as far as hurricanes, we've had 9. So we've already beaten the average season. And remember, those early season forecasts were really going with 18, 19, 20, 23 named storms. So we're nowhere near that, but this is getting to be on the busier side of average with hurricanes and also major hurricanes. We've had 4 major hurricanes now out there, and usually you don't get your third one until the end of this month. So we're ahead of schedule on hurricanes, major hurricanes, and a little bit behind schedule when it comes, or maybe a little ahead schedule when it comes to named storms, when normally the 13th one wouldn't come until the 25th. But we're still a little bit behind when it comes to some of the early season forecasts when it comes to the total named storms. But when you talk about the accumulated cyclone energy, which is kind of a weird formula, and I think I do have that in the description below too, but it kind of measures how much energy all of the tropical systems coming together come out to, and those numbers were going to be sky high. And I think the other day when I looked at it, we were about halfway to where some of the forecasts were, but we were already starting to exceed what a normal season would be. So we might be a little bit higher on that number now as we've had Milton go on by. In fact, we still have a hurricane out there, so that ACE number is still going to continue to go up. But if I don't have it in the description right now, I'll go ahead and pop that up after this broadcast is over. Well, I do hope you enjoy watching Let's Talk Tropics. I enjoy our midday visits. If you do, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications, and follow my social media pages both on Facebook and X in between storms. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll see you on Friday morning for Acadiana Weather Today at 7:30.